I have long been a fan of Faraji's work and his channel here on YouTube. If you are not already aware, Faraji is an expert in historical music, and he uploads much of his academic work and his own compositions here on YouTube for free for you to access. And recently, I was listening to Stella Splendens, a medieval Iberian song, and something came to me as I was listening to it. That title has a lot of sibilant sounds, but modern Spanish has a remarkably limited set of sibilants in its phonetic inventory. However, this was not always so. And the speakers of Old Spanish, who would have composed and sung Stella Splendens in its own time, had access to a much broader range of sibilant sounds than we see in modern Spanish. And that's what we want to look at today. How would a speaker of Old Spanish have pronounced their S's? Modern Spanish iconically lacks the voiced alveolar fricative z, present in English words like scissors, for example. But that's not the only sibilant sound that we find in abundance in the other Romance languages that Spanish lacks. Spanish speakers understandably struggle to say sh, and if I'm not mistaken, zh is very rare and certainly not found in almost any standard form of Spanish that I am familiar with. Perhaps correct me there. In fact, it's fair to say that the dominant sibilant in Spanish is simply s, pronounced in central and northern Spain as a retracted S, with speakers saying something approximating las rosas. And even then, this sibilant is often elided in accents from the Caribbean and in Andalusia. But this apparent simplification is misleading. It wasn't always so. What we have today is the consequence of merging of a whole variety of phonemically distinct sibilant sounds in Old Spanish. And it just so happens that that merging occurred just before the time of the expansion of the Spanish Empire and the time when many of its greatest poets and artists wrote and spoke. But before this great early modern merging, Spanish had somewhere between 7 and 8 distinct sibilant sounds. And to put that in perspective, from what some have told me, French has only about 4. English, notorious for its extremely broad phonetic inventory, has only about 6. So let's look at what these Old Spanish sibilants were. But before we do, let's carefully define what a sibilant is. Phonetically, a sibilant is a sound produced by forcing air through a narrow channel in the mouth. This is actually where the name comes from. The Latin sibilare meant to whistle. Say sounds like a sock, zebra, shoe, measure. And in all of those, you can see why we call them sibilants. It follows this almost whistling motion phonetically. And the sibilants tend to be articulated against the back of the teeth or the alveolar ridge, which we've looked at so much in this channel, that hard ridge just behind your teeth. But we can further break down sibilants into neater categories. And those are the categories that we will apply to the sibilants evident in Old Spanish. And this gives me a chance to talk about one of my favorite books, if we can even call it a book, the anonymous El Cantar del Mio Cid, produced more or less at around the turn of the 13th century. I remember when I first read this book, I had an edition without footnotes or commentary, and I'll never forget how much fun it was trying to reconstruct the meaning of the words that I came across by triangulating between Spanish, French, Portuguese, and Italian. Or maybe that would be quadrangulating. Anyway, if you haven't read El Cantar del Mio Cid before, I thoroughly recommend it. It's an extremely enjoyable experience, even if you pick it up in translation. It's a classic of Spanish literature, but it's also really interesting if you find the Romance languages in general fascinating. So what I want to do here is I want to look at the Cantar Primero, the first canto of the Cantar del Mio Cid, and look at where we can find evidence for all these different Old Spanish sibilants. I will also mention that in researching this video, I found a really lovely recording on YouTube in a reconstructed Old Spanish pronunciation that I'm going to link in the description. Give it a listen after you've watched this video. The first set of Old Spanish sibilants I want to look at are the dental alveolar sibilants. This means that they are articulated either against the back of the teeth or against the alveolar ridge. There are the Affricates, which come in voiced and unvoiced varieties. The unvoiced is t, which is represented by this symbol, the C with a cedilla, or just a normal C before E and I. And we can find that in this line, tornava la cabeza, in the Cantar primero. There is also the voiced counterpart, z, which would have been written with the letter Z, and that pops up in the Cantar primero in alcandras vacías. So there we have it, tornava la cabeza and alcandras vacías. So much for the Affricates in the dental alveolar category. There are also the fricatives, and here we get the familiar unvoiced fricative, s. Now, I don't know whether or not this would have been pronounced retracted back in the day. I'd be really keen to hear about that. If you know more about that particular topic, let me know in the comments below. So I'm going to try to pronounce this unretracted. But this unvoiced dental alveolar fricative was represented with the simple letter S, or sometimes with a double S when it came in an intervocalic context. And we see it in the iconic lines from the poem, Mio Cid ruidiads por Burgos entró, en su compañía 60 pendones. Naturally, to this unvoiced fricative s, we have the voiced counterpart z, which of course has disappeared from modern Spanish, and that is written with the simple S when it appears intervocalically, quite a bit like we find it in modern French. I'm not going to cite the Cantar in this case, but rather point to a famous city in Spain. Today we call it Zaragoza, or maybe Saragossa, but back in the day it was probably pronounced something like Zaragoza. Okay, so much for the dental alveolar sibilants. Then we've got the second category, the post-alveolar sibilants. And this one gets pretty interesting because, as before, they're divided between the Affricates and the fricatives, and within those categories between voiced and unvoiced. So let's start with the unvoiced ch, written with a ch, as in modern Spanish, and we find it in this line in the Cantar, Sospiró mio Cid, ca mucho había grandes cuidados. Naturally, there's its voiced counterpart, pronounced j, or perhaps je. And this is where we enter into a little bit of controversy amongst philologists and historical linguists. We can be relatively certain that Old Spanish speakers pronounced both je and je, but we don't know if these were actually phonemically distinct. We don't know if they were categorized necessarily as different sounds, or rather just simply variations on the same basic sound. Either way, we usually find it written with a G when it comes before the vowels E or I, or orthographically represented with a J. So I'm going to provide you with two lines from the Cantar, one using the one form of pronunciation and the other another form of pronunciation. So let's start with burgueses y burguesas por las finestas son, and de los ojos tan fuertemente llorando. So much for the post-alveolar Affricates. Now let's look at the fricative, sh, written with an X, and evident in this line in the Cantar, a la eixida de Bivar, ovieron la cornella diestra. And there you have it, a quick run through using the Cantar del Mio Cid of the sibilant sounds available in Old Spanish. I hope you found that interesting. If I've made any mistakes there, please let me know in the comments below, and stick around for our next video. I find the diachronic development of sibilants absolutely fascinating. In fact, I want to dedicate a next video to looking at how and why Castilian simplified and merged so many of these different sounds into the very simple sibilant system it has today, or perhaps what sibilant sounds were like in Old French. I will preface that one by saying that that too was inspired by a Faraji video, Chevalier Mourtets Guardis, which is a Crusader song, which has some very interesting sibilant sounds that I don't think are present in French today either. I hope you enjoyed this exploration of the medieval past. For now, I will say muchas gracias, and I hope to see you in the next video. Adios.